Annalise Marrow, 28, born and raised in Jersey City, New Jersey, with a law school dream I had to postpone because of debt. Let me ask you something before I tell you what happened. If you signed a marriage contract thinking it was just paperwork, and on the very first night your new husband made it clear you were a prop in his political image, would you swallow your pride and play along, or would you walk out before the ink even felt dry? I stayed, and at the time I told myself it was strategy, not weakness, but looking back now, I know that was the first lie I had to tell myself to survive. What came next? I meant what I said, Annalise. You'll sleep in the guest room, because I'm not stupid enough to confuse a contract with a real marriage. Soren Sterling said that to me on our wedding night in his restored brownstone in Hoboken, less than an hour after our reception ended, and before I had even finished taking the pins out of my hair. 3 weeks later, when reporters were shouting my name outside a courthouse and his campaign donors were pretending they had never heard of him, that same guest room was the only reason I still had any control over my life. Before I go any further, check in with me down in the comments. Type, "I'm here," tell me what state or country you're listening from, and tell me whether it's early morning, lunch break, or one of those dangerous late-night hours when stories hit a little harder. And to everyone who keeps showing up for these confessions, thank you, sincerely. I hope whatever's been weighing on your chest lately gets lighter. I hope one good surprise finds you this week, and I hope you stay with me, because this story started with a clean contract and ended with me learning exactly how expensive a simple arrangement can become. My name is Annalise Marrow. I was 28 when this happened, and at that point in my life, I was living in a tiny one-bedroom walk-up in Jersey City Heights with a radiator that banged like it was trying to send me coded messages from the dead. I worked as a program coordinator for a nonprofit that helped first-generation college students apply for scholarships and internships across New Jersey, which sounds noble and meaningful, but it did not pay enough to make my private student loans feel any less predatory. I was the oldest daughter in my family. That mattered to me more than I used to admit. My father, Dean Marrow, had been a union electrician in Newark until a shoulder injury made steady work harder. My mother, Maribel Marrow, worked front desk at a pediatric clinic in Bayonne. We were not poor in the cinematic way people like to picture poverty. We had food. We had heat most winters. We had a mother who could make 4 ingredients feel like a meal, and a father who believed a person should pay what they owe, even if it took years. But we were always one problem away from panic. When I graduated from Rutgers with a degree in political science, I thought I was going to law school within a year. That was the plan. Then my younger sister, Elora, got sick during her sophomore year of college. Nothing fatal, thank God, but serious enough to bring medical bills and enough disruption to derail the whole family for almost a year. Then my father's shoulder got worse. Then rent went up. Then life did what life does when you're not rich. It turned every plan into a luxury item. So no, I did not go to law school. I went to work. By 28, I had become the dependable one. The daughter who answered every call. The daughter who understood insurance forms better than she should have. The daughter who could smile through a donor meeting at 3 in the afternoon and then spend an hour at night staring at a spreadsheet of her debts like maybe numbers might eventually grow a conscience. I owed just under $93,000 between undergraduate loans, accrued interest, and one brutal private refinancing mistake I made at 24 because I was desperate for lower monthly payments and too embarrassed to ask for help. I wasn't drowning in the dramatic movie sense. I was drowning in the American sense. I was functioning. I was dressed. I was employed. I was charming in meetings. And under all of that, I was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. That was the condition of my life when I met Soren Sterling. He was 32, the son of a wealthy North Jersey family that had been in real estate, private development, and local political fundraising long enough for nobody to remember where business ended and influence began. He had gone to Georgetown, worked briefly in corporate law, then pivoted into policy and local politics with the kind of confidence only men with safety nets call vision. When I met him, he was running for a city council seat in Hoboken on a platform built around ethical redevelopment, infrastructure accountability, and family-centered urban planning. He said phrases like public trust and civic dignity with such ease that people around him straightened their posture when he spoke. If you saw him from a distance, he looked like the kind of candidate people trusted without realizing they were doing it. dark suits tailored so cleanly they almost seemed humble. Blonde brown hair always cut close enough to signal discipline but not vanity. Calm voice, direct eye contact. The face of a man who understood how to look sincere while leaving himself room to deny specifics later. I met him through work. Our nonprofit had been invited to a regional civic leadership summit in Newark, and I was there coordinating one of the student panels. He was speaking on youth engagement in municipal government. I remember being annoyed before I even shook his hand because men like him loved telling working people how systems could improve while quietly benefiting from those same systems staying broken for everyone else. And yet when he stepped off that stage, he didn't head straight for the donors or the cameras. He sat in the back of the room during my students' panel and actually listened. Not the fake kind of listening where people nod while waiting for applause. He took notes. He asked one of our scholarship recipients about transportation barriers for students commuting from Hudson County. Then afterward, he came over to thank me for moderating and asked if I'd be open to talking about possible partnership outreach between his campaign office and our nonprofit. I gave him my work card because saying no would have been petty. 2 days later, he emailed. The email became coffee. The coffee became a second conversation, not a date, at least not then. He was very clear about that, which I appreciated more than I expected. By the third meeting, I realized he knew exactly what impression he made on people and managed it like a professional skill. He asked thoughtful questions about my work. He remembered things I said. He didn't interrupt. He seemed curious about my family without being condescending about class differences, which rich men often are even when they think they're hiding it. The first time I went to his campaign office, it was in downtown Hoboken on the second floor of a renovated brick building above a boutique fitness studio. Everything in that office looked expensive in a restrained way. Good coffee, good lighting, framed city maps, volunteers in pressed denim and polished sneakers. Young staffers using words like momentum and message discipline while pretending they hadn't already built their entire personalities around proximity to power. That's where I met Orlando Pike, his campaign manager, 35, a former communications director from a congressional race in Pennsylvania who had the exhausted eyes of a man who considered sleep an inefficient hobby. Orlando was sharp, skeptical, and just warm enough to make you forget he was assessing every sentence you spoke. He never treated me badly, but he was the first person in Soren's orbit who made me feel that people like me were only welcome as long as we were useful. Then there was Princeton Vale, 31, one of Soren's policy advisors, from Fairfield County, Connecticut, with a finance background and the kind of smile that looked practiced in reflective surfaces. Princeton always acted as though every room needed a narrator, and he had generously volunteered. I disliked him instantly. He had an easy habit of talking about ordinary voters as though he had observed them once through clean glass. There were women in that orbit, too. Rhea Colburn, 29, the campaign's legal consultant, based in Manhattan, was the first one I trusted. She was composed, smart, and so precise with her language that I suspected she could ruin a man's week with one correctly timed sentence. She had gone to Columbia, clerked for a federal judge, and now split time between election law matters and strategic risk counsel for political clients. She seemed too intelligent to be impressed by any of them, which made me like her. And then there was Catalina Mercer. Catalina was 30, a donor liaison from Bergen County with glossy dark hair, expensive coats, and a way of standing too close when she talked to married or almost married men. She and Soren had history. I knew that before anyone said it, because some things live in the air before they reach your ears. She addressed him with a familiarity that made other people subtly look away. She laughed at things he hadn't meant to be funny. She touched a sleeve when making points. I noticed it. I filed it away. I told myself it wasn't my business. At that stage, none of it should have become my business. The proposal did not arrive wrapped in romance. That would have been easier, honestly. It happened 6 weeks after we met, after 3 more coffees, 1 fundraiser, 2 volunteer events, and 1 brutally honest conversation in which I made a careless joke about being professionally useful and personally broke. Soren didn't laugh at the broke part. He asked how bad it was. I should have lied. Instead, maybe because I was tired or maybe because he had built the right kind of trust, I told him, not everything, but enough. He sat there for a few seconds, fingers lightly folded over his coffee cup, then said, "I'm going to ask you something strange, and you can tell me to go to hell." That sentence should have warned me more than it did. He said his campaign consultants were pressuring him to stabilize his public image before the final push into election season. He had the policy credentials, fundraising network, and family name, but he didn't have what older donors kept calling an anchored personal life. He had been burned once already by a short relationship with a woman who later sold details to a gossip site. Since then, donors and older political supporters had started viewing him as polished but unreliable, not reckless, just unattached in a way that made people with money nervous. He said a marriage, quiet, respectable, believable, would help. He said he needed someone smart, discreet, and emotionally self-sufficient. Someone who understood terms. Someone who could stand beside him at a few public events, appear stable, and not mistake the arrangement for a fairy tale. Then he said the number. The compensation, spread over a fixed term with tax planning and legal oversight, would be enough to wipe out nearly all my student debt within a year. I remember staring at him, because some offers do not sound real the first time you hear them. He was matter-of-fact, almost clinical. There would be a legal contract, separate finances, separate bedrooms, media coordination provisions, confidentiality terms, a defined duration with an option to renew or dissolve quietly after the campaign cycle. He promised independent counsel for me. He promised that my reputation would be protected. He promised that if any scandal tied to his campaign created personal risk for me, the contract would require him to indemnify and shield me. That last word should matter later, so remember it. Shield. I asked why me. He said, "Because you're credible." I laughed then, one short, ugly laugh, because I knew what he meant. Not glamorous enough to look opportunistic. Educated enough to stand beside him without embarrassing anyone. Warm enough that voters would trust me. Serious enough not to act like a celebrity spouse. Working class but polished. Ambitious but not visibly scrambling. Credible. A better woman might have walked out on principle. A smarter woman might have hired counsel before hearing anything else. I did neither. I asked for time. For 4 nights, I slept badly. I ran numbers. I stared at ceilings. I imagined my loans gone. I imagined my father finally letting me pay for his physical therapy without arguing. I imagined my sister Alora finishing grad school without whispering to me over the phone that she felt guilty every time Mom sent grocery money. I imagined freedom in monthly form. I also imagined humiliation, exposure, regret. The part of myself I would have to dim in order to sign a marriage contract with a man I barely knew. I told my parents only half the truth. I said a man I knew from civic work wanted to propose a mutually beneficial marriage arrangement for image reasons and financial support. My mother cried first, which I expected. My father went quiet, which was worse. Then he asked the only good question anybody asked in that whole first week. What happens if his mess becomes your mess? At the time, I had an answer ready because Soren had given me one. It won't, I said. The contract protects me. That sentence still embarrasses me. I met with the lawyer Soren's team recommended first, a sleek Midtown attorney named Paula Denton who specialized in reputational agreements, family office contracts, and discreet settlements for people with too much money and too much to lose. She was elegant, efficient, and so obviously aligned with their world that halfway through the meeting I felt like prey being reassured by a very polite hunter. She explained terms, compensation schedule, temporary marital appearance obligations, housing arrangement, exit provisions, press conduct, privacy, mutual non-disparagement. It all sounded orderly until I asked what would happen if his campaign or family became the subject of litigation, investigative reporting, or criminal inquiry that damaged me professionally. She smiled the way lawyers smile when they would prefer not to answer directly. There are reputational mitigation measures, she said. That is not the same as protection. I know that now. Still, by then I was deep enough into the fantasy of relief that I let myself hear what I wanted to hear. The wedding happened fast. Civil ceremony in Lower Manhattan. Carefully curated guest list. Some of my family. More of his. Campaign donors. A few local reporters who were allowed just enough access to build the image and not enough to ask real questions. That was when I properly met his mother, Maribel Sterling. Yes, same first name as my mother, which felt like a cosmic joke. Maribel Sterling was 58, elegant in a cold, sharpened way, with old money restraint and the emotional warmth of a locked conference room. She had grown up in Westchester, married into development money at 23, and now chaired 2 nonprofit boards while quietly steering donors toward whichever candidate protected Sterling family interests. She looked at me with perfect manners and deep disapproval, like I was a stain someone had promised could be removed later. His father, Romeo Sterling, 61, was more subtle. A real estate attorney turned investor with homes in Hoboken, Montclair, and Palm Beach. He had the kind of expensive friendliness that never became intimacy. He shook my hand, said he'd heard wonderful things, and managed to communicate in one glance that whatever this marriage was, he already knew it was strategic. My own mother looked beautiful and nervous in navy silk she could not afford but bought anyway because she refused to let anyone in that room think she didn't know how to show up for her daughter. My father wore the same suit he had worn to Alora's college scholarship banquet and looked like a man attending an event he hadn't approved of but had chosen to survive with dignity. My sister Alora, 24, in grad school for public health, hugged me right before the ceremony and whispered, "Please tell me there's at least one secret reason this won't break your heart." I lied again. "I'm fine," I said. The ceremony itself was short. Vows carefully worded. Smiles practiced. Photos everywhere. Soren touched the small of my back, just enough for cameras. I leaned in just enough to make us look believable. If you pause the video with the sound off, we looked like a modern political couple at the start of something promising. That's the danger of still images. They preserve lies beautifully. The reception was held on the rooftop of a hotel overlooking the Hudson. White florals, narrow gold candles, a jazz trio, string lights, Hoboken glittering behind us, Manhattan in the distance. It looked like the kind of wedding women save on hidden Pinterest boards when they're pretending they're above that sort of thing. I spent 3 hours smiling until my face hurt. People said all the expected things. "You look radiant. He's lucky to have you. What a beautiful match. You two make so much sense together." There was one moment, though, that lodged under my skin. Catalina came up to us near the bar during the second hour of the reception, holding a champagne flute and wearing a soft expression that didn't match the sharpness in her eyes. She kissed my cheek and said, "You really did it." I have to admit, I didn't think Soren would ever go through with settling down. That wording was wrong in a way only women notice immediately. Before I could respond, she looked at him and added, "Still, you always were good at choosing timing over emotion." He smiled without smiling. Catalina.
Just that.
Her name, low and controlled. She lifted one shoulder.
What?
I'm being supportive. Supportive people don't look at brides like they're placeholders. That night, after the guests were gone, and the final political well-wishers had stopped pretending to care about our happiness, we drove back to the Hoboken brownstone that would now be our legal residence. The house was beautiful in the way restored wealth always is. Wide plank floors, exposed brick, careful lighting, kitchen too expensive for regular people to cook in casually. It stood on a quiet tree-lined street near the older section of town, far enough from the waterfront noise to feel established, close enough to downtown to be convenient for campaign optics. He gave me the quick tour, as though I were a tenant he wanted to retain. Primary bedroom upstairs. Guest room across the hall. Office on the parlor level. Kitchen pantry code. Alarm code. Staff cleaning schedule. Media protocols if photographers ever appeared near the house. Then I took the pins out of my hair in the bathroom mirror while he removed his cufflinks in the bedroom, and, for one stupid second, a part of me still expected him to soften. Not romantically, necessarily. Just humanly. We had done something strange and intimate and public and legally binding. Even for a contract, I thought there might be a moment of kindness. Instead, when I stepped into the bedroom doorway holding my small overnight case, he looked at me with calm detachment and said, "I meant what I said, Annalise. You'll sleep in the guest room, because I'm not stupid enough to confuse a contract with a real marriage. His tone wasn't cruel in volume. Cruelty doesn't need volume when it's certain of itself. I stood there in my wedding makeup with half my hair down and said, I know the terms. He nodded once. Good. I'm glad we understand each other. Then he added, the campaign will be more demanding from here. The less emotional ambiguity we create, the easier this will be. Emotional ambiguity. I wish I could tell you I threw the bouquet at his face and walked out. I didn't. I picked up the folded blanket from the hallway bench because someone, maybe housekeeping, maybe him, maybe nobody at all, had already placed one there for me as if the arrangement had been rehearsed. Then I took my bag into the guest room and shut the door softly enough that nobody could accuse me of dramatics. That room was lovely. Pale walls, window facing the back garden, thick duvet, nightstand lamp shaped like a blown glass tear. It was also the loneliest room I had ever seen. I sat on the edge of the bed in my wedding dress and felt something inside me go still. Not break. Breaking is louder. This was quieter. A recalculation. I told myself I had known my place. That was the agreement. That this was business. That dignity sometimes looks like discipline. I took off the dress, hung it carefully, wiped my face clean, and folded my hands in my lap for a while because I didn't trust them not to shake. At around 1 a.m, I heard his footsteps cross the hall, then silence. And that was our wedding night. The next week trained me quickly. Campaign wife life was not glamorous the way people imagine it. It was scheduled. It was managed. It was performative down to the inch. Breakfast appearances at diners where we had to look relaxed while he discussed property tax relief. Small community meetings where I stood beside him in wool coats and smiled at retired voters from uptown Hoboken. One church outreach event in Jersey City where older women squeezed my hands and told me I looked like I would be good for him. Good for him. That phrase came up often. At home, the boundaries were disciplined and absolute. Separate rooms. Shared calendar. Shared public meals if staff or guests were present. Minimal personal conversation. He was never impolite in an obvious way after that first night. In some ways, that made it worse. Open cruelty gives you something to fight. Professional distance just leaves you trying to decide whether pain counts if it is administered politely. Still, there were moments that confused me. Once, after a donor dinner ran late and I developed a splitting headache, he came into the kitchen while I was pressing a glass of water to my forehead and slid a bottle of ibuprofen across the island toward me without a word. When I looked up, he said, "You should eat something before taking that," then left. Another night, after a reporter shouted a rude question about my background outside an event, he got into the car beside me and said, very quietly, "That shouldn't have happened. Orlando will handle it." He didn't touch me. He didn't apologize for the life I had entered. He just corrected what was in front of him and moved on. That kind of measured behavior is dangerous. It lets you start building empathy where there may only be standards. I learned pieces of his history slowly. He had once been briefly engaged at 29 to a woman from a politically connected family in Connecticut, but the relationship ended after a private argument became public in humiliating, vague, expensive ways. No one told me details. I understood enough to know the aftermath had made him even more controlled. Intimacy in him had apparently curdled into liability management. His mother still treated me like I was temporary. At a brunch in Montclair the second Sunday after the wedding, she asked whether my nonprofit work was something you imagine continuing long-term or more of a placeholder while Soren's public life develops. Not what I wanted. Not whether I enjoyed it. Whether it was a placeholder. I smiled and said, "I imagine continuing to pay my own bills for the foreseeable future." She gave me the faintest smile, the kind rich women give when they recognize insolence and decide not to dignify it by reacting in public. His father was easier. Not warmer, but easier. He asked about my father's union work. He asked Alora about public health policy when she joined us one evening. He seemed to appreciate competence in a person regardless of class, though I never confused that with loyalty. Catalina remained a problem wrapped in perfume. She was always around the edges of campaign events, always with a reason. A donor list, a venue update, a sponsorship question. She didn't cross obvious lines, not enough to call out cleanly, but she had a way of talking about Soren in the past tense and present tense at once. One evening after fundraiser in Weehawken, while staff packed up signage and donors drifted toward their cars, she stood beside me under a heat lamp and said, "He's easier when he thinks someone understands the rules." That sentence sat between us like bait. I said, "I'm learning." She gave a short laugh. "Are you?" I turned to look at her fully then. "Are you trying to warn me or insult me?" "Neither," she said. "I'm just saying men in politics like clean narratives. Wives become part of that. Sometimes the woman in the clean narrative is the one who ends up dirtiest when things go wrong." Then she walked away before I could answer. I remember that clearly because it was the first time anyone in his world said something that sounded like truth instead of strategy. A few days after that, I found the first thing I should have taken more seriously. I wasn't snooping. I need to say that because it matters. I had gone into the downstairs office to print an event schedule for a volunteer outreach dinner. My printer access at home was linked to the campaign network, and Orlando had texted me the updated file. The office door was half open. His laptop sat docked and locked. 2 folders lay stacked beside the printer tray. One was labeled donor follow-up. The other, thinner and plain gray, had no label at all except a yellow sticky note with 3 words in Princeton's handwriting. Old issue file. I would have ignored it if not for what happened next. My own printout jammed, paper shifted, and the gray folder slid half open when I caught the falling stack. Inside was a copy of an old complaint filing from 3 years earlier. I only saw the first 2 pages before I heard footsteps in the hall and shoved everything back into place, but it was enough to make my stomach drop. It involved a woman's name I didn't recognize, a consulting firm previously tied to Soren's policy work, and allegations that campaign-adjacent funds had once been used to bury a personal misconduct claim before it escalated into a formal lawsuit. Not a full criminal complaint, not a conviction, but not harmless either. I barely had time to breathe before Orlando stepped into the doorway. He looked at the printer, then at me, then at the slightly crooked folder stack. "Everything okay?" His tone was casual. His eyes were not. "Paper jam," I said. He crossed the room, fixed the tray in 2 seconds, and handed me my pages. "That machine hates people who aren't on payroll." I forced a laugh. Then, because I was not as good at pretending as any of them were, I added, "Is there anything I should know before reporters decide there is?" He studied me for 1 long second. "That depends what you think you know," he said. I should have pushed. I didn't. He stepped aside, and I left with the schedule in my hands and my pulse somewhere in my throat. That night, lying in the guest room under a blanket that still smelled faintly of cedar storage, I stared at the ceiling and replayed Catalina's words. Sometimes the woman in the clean narrative is the one who ends up dirtiest when things go wrong. I told myself there were probably old allegations in every political orbit, old complaints, old threats, old settlements. None of it necessarily meant current danger. None of it necessarily meant he had lied. But something had shifted. Up until then, the contract had felt emotionally cold but structurally sound. After that folder, I started wondering whether I had signed into a story already in motion. The gaslighting began so gradually, I almost missed the pattern. The first time I tried to ask Soren directly whether there was anything in his past that could create exposure for me, he didn't get angry. He got careful. We were in the kitchen after a zoning roundtable event. He was loosening his tie. I was standing near the sink in stocking feet, holding a mug I had forgotten to drink from. I said, "I saw enough of a file in the office to know there was some kind of past complaint involving you. If that can affect me, I need to know now." He looked at me for a moment, expression unreadable. "Campaign opposition research collects old noise all the time," he said. "It's normal. That's not an answer. It's the relevant answer." "Relevant to who?" To that, he sighed and leaned one hand on the counter. "Annalise, this is exactly why I wanted emotional boundaries. You're starting to react to context you don't understand. That sentence made me feel young in the worst way. I understand enough to know my name is attached to yours now." And your name is protected. By what? By the agreement. The agreement. Every time I needed something human, he handed me paper. I said, "Have you ever told me plainly something that could hurt me if it came out?" He looked irritated then, but still controlled. "You are catastrophizing based on incomplete information." That word, catastrophizing. A favorite tool of polished men who want women to doubt their own pattern recognition. I asked if there had been a settlement. He said there had been containment of a politically motivated nuisance matter. Asked whether his former fiancée had anything to do with it. He said, "That chapter is closed." I asked whether I should have independent counsel review my contract again. That was the first time his face really changed. Not much. Just enough. "If you want to waste money on duplicate advice, that's your choice," he said. Waste money. Not, of course, I'd understand. Not, let's review concerns together. Just a calibrated reminder that I did not have his kind of money, and he knew it. After that, the house started feeling smaller. Not physically, psychologically. There are strange humiliations in contract marriage no one writes songs about. The way staff look at you when they know enough not to ask questions. The way your own footsteps sound temporary in a house where nothing belongs to you emotionally, even when your legal address says it does. The way every nice gesture from the man across the hall feels like either decency or management, and you cannot tell which. At work, I stayed quiet. I had not told anyone the real arrangement, obviously. Publicly, we were newlyweds. Respectable. Aspirational. A profile in strategic adulthood. A civic power couple in early formation. My best friend Ria, not his lawyer Ria, my friend from college, Ria Dorsey, 29, a labor organizer living in Brooklyn, noticed something was off before I said a word. She knew me too well. We met for coffee near Exchange Place one rainy Thursday evening. She took one look at my face and said, "Okay, no. That is not the expression of a woman in a weird but manageable rich person marriage." I laughed because she was right and because if I didn't laugh, I might have cried. Ria Dorsey had known me since sophomore year. She came from Baltimore, had built her whole adult life from scholarship money and stubbornness, and possessed the rare gift of making me feel less foolish without making me feel less responsible. She listened while I gave her a cleaned-up version of the truth. Not the contract. Not fully. Just enough to say that the marriage was more transactional than emotional, that I felt underinformed about his past, and that I was increasingly worried there were holes in whatever legal assurances I'd been given. She stirred her tea once, then said, "Who's your lawyer?" I met one through his side. "That is not your lawyer." I said nothing. She leaned back. "Annalise, if a politically connected man with donor parents and a campaign team has you living in his house under a contract, and you are asking me whether the lawyer he introduced is enough, then the answer is no before you finish the sentence." I knew she was right. Knowing and acting are different stages of courage. I said, "I just need to get through the election cycle." She stared at me over the rim of her cup. That sentence sounds like the opening line of a documentary where a woman later says she ignored every sign. I wish I could say I called independent counsel the next morning. I didn't. Part of it was money. Part of it was fear of looking disloyal in a system built on loyalty performance. Part of it was the simplest reason of all. I wanted to believe I could manage it. I wanted the deal to be worth the cost. I wanted the blank space where my debt used to live more than I wanted to admit the structure around me might be rotten. Then the first real humiliation happened in public. It was at a neighborhood family coalition dinner in Hoboken, one of those local events politicians love because the lighting is soft, the audience skews older, and everyone there still believes handshakes reveal character. Soren was speaking after dessert. I had spent the evening circulating between tables, smiling, listening, thanking volunteers, pretending I did not notice how often older women evaluated my face before deciding how much warmth to offer me. Toward the end of the night, one of the donors, an older developer from Bergen County named Walter Hensley, somewhere in his 60s and 3 drinks past discreet, pulled Soren aside near the stage and said something too low for me to hear fully. I caught only the end. Good move, settling down before the dirt starts moving again. Walter laughed when he said it. Not kindly, not loudly, but not privately enough. I saw the freeze in Soren's shoulders. then the smooth recovery. He smiled and said, "You should be more careful with secondhand rumors, Walter." Walter clapped his arm like they were old friends. "I'm just saying, smart timing." I felt it then. Not just suspicion, exposure. The terrible possibility that other people in that room knew they were looking at a staged marriage standing in front of a man whose past was not nearly as buried as I had been told. In the car home, I asked him what Walter meant. He stared ahead through the windshield while the driver took the tunnel approach toward Jersey City. "Nothing useful." "That doesn't sound like nothing. It sounds like drunk donor behavior," he said before the dirt starts moving again. "People in politics talk." That's still not an answer. He turned to me then, finally, and his voice went cooler than I'd ever heard it. "You need to stop treating every vague comment like a coded threat. You are making yourself anxious." There it was again, my reaction as the problem. I looked at him for a long moment and said, "Do you hear yourself?" He rubbed his forehead once, then exhaled. "Annalise, I'm in the final stage of a campaign. Opposition whispers are routine. Donor gossip is routine. If you spiral every time someone says something stupid, this arrangement won't work." This arrangement. The phrase landed harder than I expected, because now it wasn't just cold. It was a warning. We got home in silence. He went upstairs. I stood in the foyer under the chandelier with my heels in one hand and had one of those clear, awful moments where you realize that even if you are not trapped, you have definitely entered a room with fewer doors than you thought. And once a woman realizes that, she starts counting everything. What she signed, what she saved, what she overlooked, what it will cost to leave, what it will cost to stay. By the third week of the marriage, I had started keeping my own quiet records. Nothing dramatic. Not yet. Photos of event schedules. Copies of public statements. Screenshots of messages from campaign staff reminding me where to stand, what colors to wear, which family details were approved for interviews. I saved calendar invites. I saved press briefing notes. I forwarded myself one bland but interesting email in which Orlando asked staff to revisit legacy exposure contingencies before a donor breakfast. Legacy exposure contingencies. That phrase sat in my inbox like a loaded drawer. I told myself I was being prudent, not paranoid. But late at night in the guest room, I knew the truth. I was building a file because some part of me no longer believed I was fully safe inside the story I had signed. And the most humiliating part? I still hadn't told my parents the full truth. My mother kept asking whether Soren remembered I liked jasmine tea because she was trying so hard to locate tenderness somewhere in this marriage, even if she had to invent it. My father kept asking practical questions in that quiet way of his, which somehow made me feel both loved and judged. One Sunday afternoon, he came by the brownstone to help me bring in 2 storage boxes from my old apartment. Soren was out at a closed-door strategy session, and for a rare hour the house felt almost normal. My father set the second box down in the hall and looked around at the tasteful walls, the quiet staircase, the expensive stillness of the place. Then he said, "Big house. Feels lonely." That nearly broke me. I smiled too fast. "It's fine." He didn't answer right away. He ran his thumb once along the side seam of the box, then said, "Just remember, debt can make bad deals look respectable." That was my father. No speech. No lecture. One sentence that sits in your ribs for years. I wanted to tell him everything then. The guest room. The folder. The way every answer I asked for came back to me sounding like a press release. But I didn't. Because confessing would make it real in a way I still wasn't ready to survive. So I hugged him at the door and let him leave without the truth. A few nights later, the first major shock arrived. It was a Thursday, rainy, gray, the kind of Hudson County weather that makes all stone look older than it is. Soren had 3 back-to-back meetings and came home later than usual. I was in the kitchen reheating soup, barefoot, exhausted from a donor spouse's luncheon that felt like being interviewed by pearls. He came in with his coat still on, loosened a scarf, and said, "We may need to adjust the next few weeks." I looked up. Adjust how? He set a folder on the counter between us. Not slammed. Not dropped. Set. My stomach turned before I even touched it. Inside was a preliminary media response memo, prepared by Orlando and reviewed by campaign counsel. There had been an inquiry, apparently from an online local politics outlet with a talent for digging through old lawsuits and private settlements. Someone had resurfaced allegations tied to a consulting dispute from several years earlier. They were trying to connect it to Soren, donor funds, and a non-disclosure agreement involving a former staff-connected contractor. I skimmed 3 pages standing there in my own borrowed kitchen. Then I hit the line that changed everything. In anticipation of press escalation, spouse must avoid independent comment, refer all inquiries to campaign counsel, and remain aligned with approved narrative language.
Spouse must.
I looked up slowly. They already included me in the containment plan? He did not answer immediately, which is how I knew the answer was yes. How long have you known this could resurface? We had reason to think it might.
We.
The team. And you didn't think I deserved to know before I became part of your legal strategy?
His jaw tightened.
This is not criminal. That's not what I ask. It's old. That's also not what I ask. He pulled out a chair and sat down like he intended to have a reasonable conversation. I stayed standing because I knew if I sat, I might cry from anger, and I refused to give him that. He said, "There was an accusation. It was handled. It was politically motivated. The campaign has protocols. No one is asking you to do anything except stay disciplined." I laughed then, and it came out sharp enough to surprise both of us. Stay disciplined? I said, "You married me into reputational risk and put me in the response memo like I was campaign furniture." That's unfair. Is it? Because I don't remember agreeing to be drafted into scandal management. This is exactly why the contract exists. I held up the memo, then pointed to the clause where I agreed to carry fallout for facts you chose not to disclose. His silence lasted 1 beat too long. And there it was. The room changed for me in that moment. Not just the house. Him. Because until then, I had still left space for the possibility that this had all been clumsy, but containable. That maybe he was secretive, overmanaged, emotionally stunted, politically trained into bad instincts. But standing there with a scandal memo that already assumed my obedience, I finally saw the arrangement for what it really was. He had not chosen me only because I was credible. He had chosen me because credibility is easiest to rent from women who need money and still want to believe they are making a rational decision. I said, very quietly, "Did you ever intend to protect me? Or did you just intend for me not to ask the wrong questions?"
His face changed then.
Not into guilt. Into irritation stripped of politeness. "You are not the victim of my campaign." The nerve of that sentence. "No," I said. Then why is my name in a crisis memo for a scandal I wasn't even told about? Because you are my wife. And that, right there, was the ugliest irony in the whole thing. Not wife enough for a shared bed. Not wife enough for honesty. But wife enough for damage control. I put the memo down very carefully because I wanted my hands free if I decided to throw something, and I knew I couldn't afford that. He stood too, maybe sensing the shift. "Annalise."
"Don't," I said. He stopped.
I took 1 breath, then another. "If I speak to an independent attorney tomorrow, are you going to call that disloyal?" His expression hardened. "I'm going to call it escalatory." Escalatory. I almost admired how consistent he was. Every human need translated into optics. Every moral objection translated into tone. I said, "That means yes."
He didn't deny it.
Then came the line that sealed it for me. "If you act impulsively now," he said, "you could make this worse for both of us." Both of us. That old favorite. Shared consequence as a leash. Because here was the truth I understood all at once. If I didn't protect myself, they would use my silence as cooperation. And if I moved too fast without understanding the paperwork, they would frame me as unstable, ungrateful, or opportunistic. If I stayed quiet, they would keep treating me like a controlled asset. But if I panicked publicly, I could lose any leverage I still had. That was the first truly frightening moment of the marriage. Not because he shouted. He didn't. Not because he threatened me in any obvious, movie-like way.
He didn't.
It was frightening because for the first time, I could see the machinery clearly and I was standing inside it. I picked up the memo again, closed the folder, and said, "I'm going to my room." He said my name once, low, controlled. I looked at him from the doorway and said, "No, tonight you don't get to say my name like that." Then I walked upstairs carrying that folder like evidence. Inside the guest room, I locked the door for the first time since the wedding. Then I sat on the floor beside the bed in the same place where I had sat in my dress on night one, and I realized something so simple I almost hated it. The guest room had not been an insult. It had been a warning. He had put me there from the beginning because he never intended for me to belong anywhere else in his life except the part that was useful to him. And once that became clear, I knew the next move could not be emotional. It had to be legal. But before I tell you what I did next, I want your honest take because this is the point where people usually divide into two camps. If you were in my position, would you have confronted him harder that same night, packed a bag, and disappeared before dawn? Or stayed calm long enough to get your own lawyer and read every line before making a single public move? Tell me what you would have chosen, because I know some people will say I stayed one step too long. My own view now is this. When someone has already built a narrative around you, anger might feel good for 5 minutes, but paperwork can save your life for a lot longer. She was right, by the way, not about everything, but about the timing. I did not leave before dawn. I did not scream at him in the kitchen. And I definitely did not trust his team to suddenly grow a conscience overnight. I stayed still long enough to think, which was not the same as surrender. By morning, I knew two things with painful clarity. First, my marriage contract was not nearly as protective as I had been led to believe. And second, if I didn't get my own attorney before the story broke wider, I would be reduced to whatever version of me they found most convenient. I barely slept. Every hour or so I checked my phone, expecting headlines, leaked posts, or some local reporter to decide a city council candidate's wife from Jersey City was now fair game. Nothing public had exploded yet, but silence did not calm me anymore. Silence only meant the story was still choosing where to land. At 6:30, I showered, dressed for work, and left the brownstone before Soren came downstairs. He texted once while I was in the rideshare, heading toward Jersey City. "We should align before outside council gets involved." Not. "Are you okay?" Not. "I'm sorry." Not even. "Let's talk." Align. I stared at the screen long enough to feel my own pulse in my teeth, then locked my phone and looked out the window at the Holland Tunnel traffic crawling in the distance. That one word told me everything I needed to know about the next phase. He still thought this was about message discipline. He still thought the danger was disorder, not deception. By 9:15, I was sitting in a glass-walled conference room in Lower Manhattan across from an attorney named Elora Beck. Yes, Elora. Different Elora than my sister, and maybe God has a sense of humor because this Elora Beck was exactly the kind of woman I needed at that moment. She was 41, based in Tribeca, a former matrimonial litigator who had shifted into crisis-adjacent contract disputes, image agreements, and family asset exposure cases for women who discovered too late that a sophisticated document could still be a trap. She wore a charcoal suit, no-nonsense makeup, and the expression of someone who did not enjoy rich men explaining anything to her. Rhea Dorsey had made the introduction at 7 that morning after I finally called and said the words out loud. "It's worse than I told you." Rhea didn't waste time with sympathy first. "Good," she said. "Not good that it's worse. Good that you've stopped minimizing it. I'm sending you someone. Don't tell his team where you are." So I didn't. I emailed Elora Beck from my personal account. I sent the contract, the memo I had photographed before leaving the house, and the few saved emails I thought might matter. By the time I arrived, she had already reviewed enough to look offended on my behalf. She tapped the contract once with a pen and said, "You signed this without your own lawyer." It wasn't a question. Yes. She nodded once, like a doctor confirming a broken bone before telling you how bad the fracture is. "All right, then let me give you the clean version. This is not the worst agreement I've ever seen, but it was not drafted to protect you as an equal party. It was drafted to operationally contain you." That sentence made my stomach drop and my shoulders loosen at the same time. There is a strange relief in hearing your private fears spoken plainly by a professional. I said. How exposed am I? That depends what comes out publicly, whether his team tries to position you as cooperative cover, and whether any third parties decide your role makes you a useful witness. I blinked. Witness.
She slid the memo toward me.
If prior misconduct, settlement behavior, donor money usage, or campaign coordination become part of a formal investigation or civil discovery process, people may want to know what the spouse knew and when. Even if you knew nothing, you are now in the frame. The frame. That was the word, wasn't it? I had been moved into the frame. She went clause by clause after that. Compensation structure. Valid, but delayed in ways that gave his side leverage. Confidentiality. Overly broad. Public conduct obligations. Precise and favorable to his campaign. Housing. Tied to performance of marital appearances more than personal stability. Exit provisions. Weak. Indemnification language. Shallow. Vague. And full of discretionary wording that would make enforcement harder than Soren had implied. Then she pointed to one paragraph halfway through the contract and said, "This is the problem." I leaned forward. The clause stated that if campaign-related media controversy arose from pre-existing matters not newly created during the marriage, the parties would cooperate in good faith to preserve mutual reputational interests. On the surface, that sounded balanced. In practice, Alora explained, it created expectation without specific remedy. It talked about cooperation, not protection. It referenced mutual reputational interests, but not separate counsel, personal defamation coverage, relocation costs, emergency dissolution, or compensation adjustment if I became the direct target of press scrutiny. In simpler words, I had signed a deal that treated my reputation like an extension of his campaign. I asked the question I had been avoiding since night one. "Can I leave?" "Yes," she said. "This is not prison." I laughed, but not because it was funny. Then she added, "But leaving badly and leaving strategically are two different things." There it was, the actual crossroads. She told me the best move was not immediate dramatic departure. Not yet. First, document everything. Second, send formal notice that I had retained independent counsel. Third, demand temporary non-disparagement reinforcement, media separation language, relocation coverage if needed, and renegotiation of the crisis clause before any further public use of my image or statements. Fourth, if they resisted, prepare for controlled exit. Not emotional exit. Controlled exit. I said, "What if they say I'm escalating?" She gave me the driest half smile I saw all year. "Of course they'll say you're escalating. Women asserting contract rights are always called emotional by men who built the emergency." That almost made me cry, which annoyed me because I hate crying in expensive offices. Instead, I asked what I should do if reporters approached me before this was settled. She said, "Say nothing. Not because you owe him silence, because you owe yourself precision." That became the rule. By lunchtime, Alora had drafted a formal notice letter on her firm's letterhead. It was clear, direct, and devastating in its politeness. Effective immediately, I was represented independently. Any further legal or contractual communications regarding marital obligations, reputational management, media positioning, or crisis response were to go through counsel. Pending clarification of pre-existing risk and protections, I would not participate in unscripted campaign appearances or press messaging tied to the resurfacing allegations. We requested immediate renegotiation of the reputational risk section, addition of an exit clause tied to campaign collapse or formal inquiry, specific indemnity language, temporary housing protection, and reimbursement of my legal fees. In other words, I was done being rented informally. Before sending it, Alora looked at me and said, "Once this goes out, the temperature will change." "It already has," I said. She nodded. "Good. That means you're caught up to reality." By 1:30, the letter was sent. Soren called 7 minutes later. I let it ring out. Then Orlando called. I let that ring out too. Then Princeton, which almost made me laugh because what exactly did he think he was bringing to the situation, besides a smug face and a finance vocabulary? Then finally I got a text from Soren. "You blindsided me." I typed 3 responses and deleted all of them. Then I sent the only one worth sending. Your counsel has my attorney's information. I spent the rest of the afternoon at work pretending my life was not changing by the minute. That day reminded me how strange ordinary labor can feel when your private world is splitting open. I sat in a program review meeting about scholarship outreach metrics while, under the table, my phone filled with calls from a political machine discovering I had boundaries. I answered student emails about resume formatting. I approved a catering invoice for an alumni event. I smiled at my supervisor. And all the while I was waiting for the first real detonation. It came at 4:12. A local digital outlet published the initial story. Not a full expose. Not yet, but enough. The headline was carefully poisonous. Questions resurface around Hoboken candidates' past consulting ties, settlement handling. There were no criminal charges in the piece. That mattered. But there were references to internal communications, donor concern, and an unnamed former contractor who had once alleged retaliatory silencing after raising claims about inappropriate conduct and financial smoothing around a consulting relationship tied indirectly to Soren's prior policy network. The article also mentioned that Soren's recent marriage had strengthened his family values image ahead of the election. That one line made me cold from the inside out. My recent marriage. My face, my name, my existence as context for his legitimacy. Then the second wave came, faster and uglier. Social media clips, amateur commentary, screenshots of wedding photos, strangers deciding what kind of woman marries a candidate 3 months before an election. Some people called me calculated. Some called me a beard for donor trust. Some pitted me in that sticky, public way that feels almost worse than cruelty. One comment with a lot of reposts read, either she knew and married him anyway, or she didn't know, and that's even more embarrassing. That one got under my skin because it captured the trap so perfectly. Guilty if aware. Pathetic if not. By 5, my boss asked if I wanted to go home early. I said no, partly because I needed the paycheck, partly because I knew going home no longer sounded like safety. By 6:15, there were 2 reporters outside the nonprofit office building. Not a mob, not cameras with crews, just 2 local press people and one guy with a phone trying to behave like a freelancer. Still, it was enough to make my body go alert all over. One of them spotted me as soon as I stepped out. Mrs. Sterling, did you know about the prior complaint before the wedding? I kept walking. Are you standing by your husband? My husband. Interesting how fast that title appears when damage needs a feminine wall. Did campaign attorneys ask you to stay quiet? That one almost made me stop, which is exactly why I didn't. A security guard from our building stepped closer to me and said, "This way," guiding me toward the rideshare pickup lane. I thanked him, got into the car, and only once the door was shut did I realize my hands were numb. I did not go back to the brownstone. I went to my parents' house in Bayonne. When my mother opened the door and saw my face, she didn't say hello. She just pulled me inside and said, "What happened?" And that was the moment the truth finally arrived in full. Not for the public, for my family. My father sat at the dining table, still in work boots, one shoulder wrapped in an old heating brace, and listened without interrupting while I told them everything. The contract, the separate rooms, the scandal memo, the weak clause, the attorney, the letter, the reporters, the guest room on the wedding night. Every humiliating part of it. My mother cried quietly halfway through and kept apologizing, which broke my heart because none of it was her fault. My father did not cry. He looked like a man slowly organizing rage into usable shape. When I finished, the room went quiet except for the refrigerator hum and traffic outside. Then my father said, "Did he touch you in anger?"
No.
"Did he threaten you?" "Not directly." "Did he lie by omission?" "Yes." That answer seemed to settle something in him. "Then you don't go back alone," he said. My mother asked if I was safe legally, which was such a Maribel question. Not dramatic.
Precise.
Safe legally. "I have a lawyer now," I said.
Now.
Not when it would have spared me pain.
But now.
That night I slept in my childhood room, which still had faded tape marks from old posters and a bookshelf full of things I once thought I would outgrow emotionally. It was cramped and imperfect and so much safer than the polished guest room in Hoboken that I nearly laughed into the pillow. The next morning, Alora Beck called with the first formal response from Soren's side. They wanted a meeting. Of course they did. Not a written concession. Not an apology. A meeting. Men like that always want a room first, because in a room they can still try charm, pressure, and tone management before a record gets too clear. I said, "Do I have to go?" "No," she said, "but I recommend it with me present. It lets us see whether they intend to solve this or merely contain you better." So the meeting was set for Friday at 11 in a private conference room at Alora's office downtown. Before I tell you what happened in that room, let me ask you something else because this part still fascinates me. When the story first broke and strangers started pulling apart my life online, would you have hidden completely, posted your side immediately, or done what I did and gone silent until every document was in front of the right lawyer? Drop your real answer, not the noble one. Honestly, I still think silence was the only smart move then, not because they deserved my restraint, but because I refused to let panicked words become free ammunition for people already writing my role without my permission. Friday morning, I wore navy. That sounds small, but women know it isn't. Clothes are language, especially when men are expecting you to look either frightened or theatrical. Navy said controlled. Navy said employed. Navy said I understand the cost of paper. Alora met me in the lobby and handed me a coffee I did not want but held anyway because it gave my hand something to do. We went upstairs. The conference room overlooked Lower Manhattan and smelled faintly like cedar and litigation. Soren arrived with Paula Denton and Orlando. No Princeton, which I was grateful for. One less ornamental opinion in the room. He looked composed, but not untouched. Dark circles under the eyes. Jaw tighter than usual. Tie slightly off-center, like he had dressed alone in a hurry. Orlando looked like a man managing 3 small fires and 1 large one. Paula looked exactly the same as before, which I suppose is a professional talent. No one shook hands. Alora began. "Before anyone says anything informal," she said, "I want the record clear that my client disputes the adequacy of the original disclosure surrounding pre-existing reputational risk and rejects any assumption that marriage under this agreement constituted open-ended crisis participation. That was why I paid her." One sentence, and the air itself got less friendly. Paula responded first, all cool polish. "No one is alleging open-ended participation. We are dealing with an old matter being opportunistically distorted during a campaign." Alora said that old matter was sufficiently foreseeable that his team had a spouse response memo prepared. Orlando shifted in his seat. Small movement. Important. Paula said, "Preparedness is not admission." Alora smiled faintly. "Neither is marriage a waiver." Then Soren finally spoke. "Annalise, I did not intend for you to feel ambushed." I turned to look at him. "Then why did I learn my role from a memo?" A pause. He said, "Because the team moved quickly once the inquiry came in." "No," I said. "Try again." Orlando glanced at Paula. Paula glanced at Soren. And I saw it, the exact moment people accustomed to controlling narratives realize the woman in the room is no longer there to help. Soren exhaled slowly. I believed the matter would remain buried unless activated politically. Buried. There it was. Not noise. Not nothing. Buried. And you married me without clearly explaining that? I did not anticipate direct risk to you. You anticipated enough to script me. His face hardened a little. We prepared contingencies. Which included my silence. Which included discipline. I almost laughed again, but Alora got there first. "Let's stop using campaign language," she said. "My client is not a field volunteer." That was the line of the day. The discussion got technical after that. Alora laid out our demands point by point. A revised indemnification clause with explicit reimbursement for legal fees, reputational counsel, relocation costs, and lost income if press harassment or campaign fallout interfered with my employment. An immediate amendment clarifying that I was under no obligation to make public statements, attend campaign appearances, or remain in the marital residence during any scandal-related escalation. A clean exit provision if formal inquiry, donor collapse, or campaign withdrawal materially changed the original premises of the agreement. A temporary housing fund and security support if media presence made either residence unsafe or unworkable. Mutual non-disparagement with actual enforcement language. Acknowledgement that any pre-existing misconduct or settlement-related matter undisclosed before execution materially affected my consent. That last one hit hardest. Materially affected my consent. Paula objected immediately to the wording. Orlando objected more quietly. Soren didn't object at all, which interested me. Then they asked for a break. When they stepped out, I sat very still and stared at the table while Alora reviewed notes. After about 30 seconds, she said, "You're doing well." I said, "I hate that I still care whether he feels ashamed." She looked up. "That's normal. But let's aim for enforceable. That sentence should be embroidered on pillows for women." When they came back in, the temperature had changed. Paula offered partial concessions. Stronger fee coverage. Optional media withdrawal. Temporary separate residence allowance. No required public appearances. Narrowed cooperation language. They resisted the phrase materially affected consent, but were willing to accept an acknowledgement that certain pre-existing risk factors were not fully itemized in detail before execution. That was lawyer language for yes, but we'd rather die than say yes plainly. Then Soren did something I did not expect. He asked if he could speak to me directly, on the record, but without interruption. Alora looked at me. I nodded. He turned to me fully. When I proposed the arrangement, he said, "I believed I could keep older damage from touching you. That was arrogant. I can see that now." That was the closest thing to an apology I had ever heard from him. He continued, "I was focused on outcome. Stability, campaign protection, optics. I treated the contract like structure and assumed structure was enough." I said nothing. Then he added lower, "I should have respected the difference between agreement and informed agreement." And there it was, not a redemption, but a truth. I asked the question that had been sitting in me since the wedding. "Did you ever choose me for any reason that wasn't usefulness?" He held my gaze, and for the first time since I met him, he looked like a man without a prepared answer. Finally, he said, "At the beginning, usefulness was the reason I could justify. After that, it became more complicated than I let it." That answer hurt more than a lie would have, because it was probably true. Not enough truth. Not early enough, but true. I said, "Complicated is not protection." "I know." And that was the end of the personal portion, because some conversations die not from shouting, but from accuracy. By 3 that afternoon, we had the broad outline of a revised agreement. Not finalized, but real. My legal fees covered. My right to separate residence preserved. No mandatory campaign appearances. No use of my likeness or marital narrative in press materials without explicit written consent. An emergency exit clause triggered by campaign collapse, formal inquiry, or documented reputational harm affecting my employment or safety. Specific indemnity language if I became a direct media target due to undisclosed premarital risk. And most importantly, a structured path to confidential dissolution if the amended terms were breached. When it was done, Orlando asked for 24 hours to circulate final red lines. Alora gave him 12. That made me like her even more. The story outside, meanwhile, kept moving. Another article came out over the weekend, this one broader and Messier. Donors were reportedly concerned. A former associate of Soren's old consulting network anonymously described a pattern of private smoothing and public denial. 2 local endorsers paused appearances with the campaign. Then a regional paper picked it up, which meant the thing had moved from annoying scandal to actual damage. That was when the calls from strangers got nastier. Not just press now. Random people. Anonymous numbers. A voicemail from someone accusing me of being a gold digger. Another from a woman saying I represented everything fake in politics. One message called me the guest room bride, which meant someone either knew too much or had gotten lucky in their cruelty. I did not tell my parents about that one, but I did tell Alora Beck, and by Monday she had arranged a digital security consultant to scrub personal address exposure and route formal inquiry channels properly. Again, that is what actual protection looks like. Not a man saying trust me over candlelight. A woman sending the right invoice to the right specialist by noon. I stayed with my parents through that weekend, and the longer I stayed, the more I realized how much my body had changed in the brownstone without me noticing. In Bayonne, I slept through the night. I ate without nausea. I stopped flinching every time my phone lit up. My mother left cut fruit in the fridge like I was 16 again. My father pretended not to hover while absolutely hovering. My sister Alora came over Sunday with takeout and sat cross-legged on my old bed while we dissected every legal term she could remember from my frantic summaries. She listened, then said, "You know what bothers me most?" "What?" "That he understood your need well enough to make the offer attractive, but not your humanity well enough to make it safe." I stared at her. "That's disgustingly insightful." She shrugged. "I do public health. We study systems. Men like him are systems with nice shoes." I laughed so hard I had to put my head in my hands. That laugh mattered. Because around then, something inside me stopped framing this as a romantic tragedy and started seeing it as what it actually was. An asymmetrical contract entered under unequal knowledge and mutual self-deception. Yes, there was sadness in that. Yes, there was humiliation. But once I named the structure, I got stronger inside it. On Tuesday, the campaign cracked. Not theatrically, politically. A significant donor withdrew publicly, citing unresolved concerns regarding transparency and judgment. 2 volunteer coordinators resigned. A debate invitation was rescinded pending clarification of ongoing reporting. Then one of the older party figures who had backed Soren released a statement so cold and cautious it might as well have been a funeral card. By evening, local analysts were openly asking whether he would suspend the race. I was not in a room when that decision was made, but I know roughly how it happened. Orlando later confirmed enough through counsel. Internal polling dipped. Donor confidence collapsed. The family pushed for containment. Romeo Sterling apparently argued the name could survive if Soren stepped back before formal review deepened. Maribel Sterling, according to rumor I absolutely believe, was furious less about the original misconduct than about the loss of message control. Wednesday morning, Soren suspended the campaign. He did it in a brief statement outside a municipal building in Hoboken. No spouse present, no family beside him, no triumphant music, no smiling supporters in matching windbreakers. Just him, a podium, 2 cameras, and the posture of a man discovering that polished restraint cannot always outpace old smoke. He framed the decision as an attempt to avoid distracting from city issues. He denied serious wrongdoing. He said he would address historical matters in appropriate channels. He thanked supporters. Then he stepped away before reporters could turn the statement into a live autopsy. Do you know what I felt when I saw the clip?
Not joy.
Relief first, then grief, then something close to emptiness. Because when a person who has been controlling the weather of your life suddenly loses that power, there is a strange silence afterward. You expect vindication to sound louder than it does. That afternoon, the final revised contract arrived. Alora Beck reviewed every line with me over video call while I sat at my parents' dining table with a yellow legal pad and a mug that said "World's Okayest Daughter," which my sister had bought me as a joke years earlier. The amended agreement included the clauses we needed. Not perfect, but real enough to stand on. Most important of all, it included a dissolution option exercisable by me within a defined window following campaign suspension tied to undisclosed pre-existing reputational harm. It also required confidential cooperation on separation logistics, barred use of any narrative framing me as supportive cover, and gave me a financial settlement materially larger than the original closing compensation because the risk basis of the arrangement had changed. In plain English, he had to pay for the lie becoming expensive.
I signed.
Not because I was forgiving him, because I was done giving chaos access to my future. 2 days later, I returned to the brownstone one last time with Alora's associate, a driver, and an itemized move.
List.
Soren was there. That detail matters, because he could have arranged to be absent and chosen cowardice. He didn't. The house looked exactly the same. That was almost insulting. Same clean counters, same framed maps, same quiet staircase, same guest room across the hall from the bedroom where I had never been invited to belong. I went upstairs and packed methodically.
Clothes.
Laptop,
Shoes.
toiletries, the few books I had moved in, the ceramic bowl my mother gave me, the gray sweater I wore the morning after the wedding, the blanket from the guest room. Yes, I took the blanket, not because I wanted anything from that house, because I wanted one physical object that had witnessed the truth with me. While I was zipping my suitcase, Soren appeared in the doorway. He did not come in. I respected that. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then he said, "I thought you might leave before I had the chance to say this properly." I kept folding a blouse. That would have been safer for both of us. Probably. He looked tired in a human way now, not a strategic one. No camera posture. No campaign voice. Just a man standing in the wreckage of his own design.
"I was wrong," he said.
Not just legally. Personally. I set the blouse down and finally looked at him. Those are related. Yes. He swallowed once before continuing. I built something I thought I could control. I told myself the honesty I withheld was manageable because the structure was clear. But it wasn't honesty. It was advantage. That was the best sentence he ever gave me. I said, "You don't get extra credit for understanding the damage after it hurt someone." I know. He did know. At least that much. Then he said something that might have mattered in another universe. "I did come to care about you." I believe him. That was the worst part. Because care without courage is still selfish. Care without disclosure is still manipulation. Care that arrives only after exposure is just grief wearing better shoes. So I told him the truth. "Maybe you did," I said, "but you cared in a way that still required me to be useful first. I can't build a life inside that." He nodded. No defense. No argument. That, more than anything, convinced me the loss had finally reached him. When I wheeled the suitcase past him into the hall, he stepped aside. No touching. No dramatic last kiss. No cinematic plea. Just space. And that was the closest either of us came to doing right by me inside that marriage. The public ending, of course, was less clean. A month later, a formal ethics review connected to one branch of the older consulting matter was announced at the county level. Not criminal charges. Not some explosive televised raid. An ethics review, document requests, interviews, and donor scrutiny. Enough to stain. Enough to matter. Enough to prove my attorney had been right about the danger of being near the frame when the picture finally developed. Because of the revised agreement, I was not dragged into it publicly. That was the point. My counsel made clear I had no comment and no operational role in prior matters. My employer received a short letter explaining that I had proactively separated from campaign activity and taken legal steps to protect my professional standing. It wasn't glamorous. It was effective. The nonprofit kept me. That mattered more than I can explain. My supervisor told me privately that some board members had asked questions after the news cycle intensified, but my documented separation and professional reputation were strong enough that no one wanted to punish me for a political mess I did not create. I went into the bathroom afterward and cried for 2 minutes in a stall, then washed my face and went back to work because surviving sometimes looks embarrassingly normal. As for the Sterlings, consequences arrived in layers. Maribel Sterling stopped pretending I had been temporary by choice and started pretending I had been unstable all along, which did not work because the amended contract barred disparagement, and Elora Beck had the kind of patience lawyers reserve for women who weaponize tone. One firm let her shut that down. Romeo Sterling, interestingly, sent a handwritten note. Not warm, not apologetic, but honest in its own narrow way. He wrote that he respected the seriousness with which I handled an untenable situation and wished me steadier ground ahead. That was more dignity than I expected from him, and I'll give credit where it's due. Orlando left the campaign world 3 months later, at least temporarily, and took a strategic communications role with a healthcare nonprofit in Philadelphia. I learned that through Rhea, who learned everything somehow. I suspect he was tired of polishing rotten wood and calling it architecture.
Catalina?
She disappeared so quickly from the public picture, it was almost elegant, which told me she had either better instincts than I gave her credit for, or better options. And me? I moved into a small but decent apartment in Jersey City near Journal Square, with good light in the morning and a laundromat downstairs that never had enough rolling baskets. My legal settlement, combined with the original partial compensation already paid, allowed me to clear the worst of my private student debt and restructure the federal portion without panic. I did not become rich. I became breathable. That was enough. The first night in my new apartment, I sat on the floor eating Thai takeout from the carton because my table hadn't arrived yet. The place smelled faintly of paint and old wood. The radiator hissed. A siren passed somewhere outside. My phone was quiet, and for the first time in months, silence felt like mine. There's one more thing I should tell you because it completes the circle. A few weeks after the dissolution papers were finalized, I found the blanket from the guest room still folded in the back of my closet. I almost donated it. Then I spread it over the end of my bed instead. Not as a wound, as a record. That blanket reminds me of the night I first understood that a pretty arrangement can still be a cold room, and that knowing your place is not the same thing as accepting it forever. If I learned anything from all this, it's that protection you can't explain clearly probably isn't protection, and love that only functions under controlled conditions is not safe enough to build a future on. A contract can organize obligations. It cannot manufacture decency. And whenever someone needs your trust faster than they're willing to earn your informed consent, slow down. Slow all the way down. Now tell me this, was this story actually gripping enough to keep you hooked? Or were you yelling at your screen for me to leave sooner? And have you ever been in something that looked respectable from the outside but felt wrong the moment the door closed behind you? Put your experience in the comments if you want to share it, because somebody reading might need to know they're not the only one who missed the warning the first time. If this story kept you with me to the end, go watch the newer stories waiting on the right side of your screen, because trust me, the next one is just as messy in a completely different way. Share this with someone who always has strong opinions about relationships, contracts, or family image games. Hit subscribe and send me a comment telling me where in the story you knew this marriage was never going to survive.